Welcome back to Presidents in Politics. I am one of your hosts, Professor Caleb McGee, joined with my fellow co-hosts, former Congressman Ross. Morning. We're on the 30th president, Calvin Coolidge.
Keep cool with Coolidge.
Keep cool with Coolidge. I have to tell you, and we talked about this before the podcast began, being a professor, you study and you read a lot of these presidents throughout your career, but to go back and revisit Coolidge again, I forgot how much I liked him. He was a solid dude.
He was very solid. He was, I think, very risk-averse.
Yes.
Very conservative.
Yes.
What we would consider today, I think, a staunch libertarian.
Yeah. Maybe that's why I like him.
Yes. And he did some things that I thought were pretty cool. When he was lieutenant governor, I guess he was either in the legislature or lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, when the police union.
Oh, the Boston police strike. I'm glad you're going into this.
And one thing I've always agreed with this, because I face this in my legislative career, is when the police union goes on strike, and he says, "Oh no." Mm-hmm. No, you can never have a public safety union go on strike. I mean, that is almost seditious, I guess, because you are entrusted with the safety of the public.
Exactly.
And we've put that trust in you, and you've got to hold that trust under any circumstance. Because we've seen, even Kennedy was that way. Kennedy was, did not believe in public unions going on strike, public safety unions going on strike. And I think to this day we still, try to follow that. I remember when Reagan was
air
president,
traffic controllers,
air traffic controllers,
yes.
And he fired them all.
Yes, and then rehired and retrained an entire new batch.
Correct.
And a lot of individuals like, you're wasting so much money. This is ridiculous. But he got his point across, and
yes.
it took care of a lot of the issues.
Yes, and I think that's where I'm not against unions as per se. Because it does keep management in check.
Right.
But when you're talking about the health, safety, and welfare of the public, you can't allow them to be considered as regular unions and just walk off the job, and in doing so create chaos and havoc. And
I remember reading that before this takes place, Coolidge could read the environment. He knew the police were going to strike,
right.
And he gives a speech first.
Correct.
Yeah, and his mind is he was not one of just the naturally most gifted, keen minds like Jefferson,
right.
or one of those, but he worked hard, consistently studied, and he shaped his mind.
Yes.
And he had a good history and philosophy understanding. So I like that about him. And when he came to this speech that he gives before the police were going to strike, one of the things he talked about was Shays' Rebellion. He goes back and he starts listing the history of like the American colonial period, the American Revolutionary period.
They had to call in the troops.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's basically like, here historically, and I love this about his mind, it's historical precedents, right? Which he was a lawyer, so maybe this is where the precedents comes from. And he starts walking through and he says, historically, this doesn't end well. And he basically kind of gives them a warning, like, don't walk off the job, it's not going to end well for you. So again, like you said, he's lieutenant governor, I believe,
I think he
of Massachusetts. This is the Boston Police Department. The Boston Police Department, they walk off the job. He calls the National Guard to break the strike up, fires every one of them, and rehires an entire new police force.
Yes.
And he catches national attention for it.
He does. It catapults him.
Yes.
Because as we talked about in Harding, I mean, Harding was the least impressive candidates. Well, they nominate him on the 10th ballot.
Yes.
And then they put Coolidge in.
Yes.
And Coolidge is not very. In fact, he's frustrated with his ceremonious duties as vice president.
And he was born in Vermont. It's not like it's a big move for electoral college votes either. It's like he's carrying a big home state. He's carrying Vermont. That's like carrying Rhode Island. Right? Yeah. Like who really cares? Honestly,
where's the political,
right? Or carrying. I guess maybe today's time Wyoming because the electoral college. Like who really cares if you're carrying that? So it's not necessarily a master political move.
No.
But man, he's got the personality.
He does, and he starts attending cabinet meetings. He starts attending, going out and making speeches, doing things to just stay from being bored as vice president.
Yes.
And then the next thing you know, boom, Harding dies.
Yeah.
And we have a president who is inaugurated, sworn into office by his father.
Yes, which had never happened before.
No.
And one of the cool things, I remember reading through this in his autobiography, when he dies and now Coolidge is going to come in, it's like 2:35 in the morning. He's back in his home state of Vermont, staying with his dad. His dad's a notary to the public. That's why his dad can swear him in. And while he's there, once he catches word, they tell him the president's died, you're going to be the president. The first thing he does is he gets his copy of the United States Constitution. He always keeps with him, and he reads through to make sure it is constitutional for him to become president. I mean, the 25th Amendment's already passed.
You're right.
But he wants to re-look through it again. This is his mind, because for him, he's a stickler for the rules, right? And he wants to reassess if this is the actual right course of action. So here's what he does. He reads through the Constitution again, reads through the amendments again, decides that, yes, he does have the right to become president. Then he takes his wife and they pray together.
Wow.
And then he goes and his father swears him into office.
Wow.
That's one of the, to me, that's like just that represented who he was as an individual.
He understood the magnitude of what he was about to enter.
Yeah, and it's 2:30 in the morning.
2:30 in the morning.
2:30 in the morning. He's at his dad's like farmhouse in Vermont. I think I read somewhere that it was such an old house that he's reading the Constitution with a kerosene lamp.
Amazing.
And to me, one of the things about Coolidge, and I think you'd probably agree with this, he's a throwback to presidents of years gone by.
That's true. That's
and
true.
I think that this imagery, he
had a grandfather who fought in the Revolutionary War. Yeah.
This imagery of him taking the oath of office, reading the Constitution by a kerosene lamp in an old Vermont farmhouse is really just foreshadowing of the type of economic policies that he'll have as a leader. He wanted to return to author's intent. You and I talk about this a lot. The idea of author's intent, right?
Yeah.
And this is what he wanted. I think we need more politicians. I think you agree with me on this because I think this is how you conducted yourself. We need more politicians that have author's intent.
Absolutely.
What were the founding fathers actually thinking when they wrote these things? Not what do I want or what is the emotional climate or political climate of my constituents around me.
Correct.
But what is actually the founder's intent of the way this country was founded?
And ironically, he was born on the 4th of July.
Yes. Again, there's a lot of you and I have said this as Christians, as men of faith. You see God's providential hand.
Oh yes.
All these just little things.
Think about it. I mean, we've got this corrupt nation going under Warren Harding.
One of the most corrupt presidents he's ever been.
Yes, and then Coolidge comes in as the steady hand.
Yes.
Silent
cow,
and they prosecute the Secretary of Interior for the Teapot Dome scandal. They get rid of the Attorney General. I mean, this guy cleans house.
And he does and I know you appreciate this because of your work. This is one of the things you emphasize when he builds the investigatory committee. It's bipartisan.
Yes,
and it's one of the first times in several generations that's happened.
And he makes sure that nobody joins his administration who was or is a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's correct.
Which is amazing at that time in the 20s.
In that time period, that's huge because the KKK is resurgence in the 1920s in the South. It's really, really growing with these new ideas of nationalism and populism. It's growing in the South, and he takes a hard stance against it. He also takes a hard stance to protect the Native Americans. In fact, he's one of the first who passes an act that all Native Americans are citizens.
Yeah.
And this is what, 1920?
That's a tremendous foresight, and politically that takes a lot of fortitude.
Yes, but what amazes me is these individuals have been here for hundreds of years before us, and it's not until the 1920s that we actually recognize citizenship.
You're right.
And you have to go, who didn't think of this earlier?
You're right.
Right?
They were here first.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
But silent Coolidge.
So in fact, he was so silent that he would not speak.
That's right.
At events.
That's
in
right.
fact, they placed a lady next to him.
I love this story. I love this story.
She's gonna make him talk, and she tells him, "Mr. President, I bet I can make you say at least 3 words." And he looked at her and said, "You lose."
Yes.
And
I read that. And I love that about him. He talked about the fact early on, and I think I wrote this quote down. Oh, here it is. He said that the most important thing as president is to be frugal with his words because he didn't want to be misquoted. There's a lot of wisdom in that.
Boy, there is.
And then he said this, and I love this. He said, I say only yes or no to people, and even that is too much, and it'll wind them up for more than 20 minutes.
Isn't that something?
And I think you could agree with this. For people in leadership, and we get this, when you have positions of leadership, you're misquoted all the time.
Absolutely.
All the time.
Well, for political purposes, yeah. It can be used against you.
And here he is, and he's like, I learned early on to be frugal with my words. It makes me think about the book of Proverbs where Solomon is writing, and he says, where there is a multitude of words, there is sin. Right?
Wow. And
it makes you stop and think that a lot of times we get ourselves in trouble with our multitude of words.
Well put.
And
I know I've been there.
I'm of Irish descent, my friend. I have definitely been there. We're storytellers by nature.
Wow.
But as I really stopped and thought about this, there's something to be said of that. There's something to be said of his mentality that he was going to be frugal with his words, and that frugality was not with his words. It was also, and this is where we could spend a little time, with his economics.
Yeah.
He was fiscally conservative. Some biographers have made the statement, I agree with this, he set the modern precedence for what because he's Republican, for what the Republican fiscal conservative would be. I would say in many ways he's the most fiscally conservative president in the Republican Party until Ronald Reagan.
Probably.
Coolidge and Reagan have a lot in common.
In fact,
that'd be an interesting book, like to parallel their presidencies.
I think Reagan looked to him as his idol.
Me too.
Which is interesting because then you have Hoover, of course, that follows, and then it just blows up. And
that kind of falls apart.
He decides not to take a second term, and I wonder if that would have made any difference with the Great Depression.
I have to wonder that too.
Because I think he feels guilty that he probably allowed some of it to develop.
Yes.
The bubble to develop, which
Yes.
burst and caused the stock market crash.
Yes.
And-
If we can we talk about those economics for a minute? The economics of the 20s. So many people, when we look at the Great Depression of the 30s, right, the dirty 30s, the Roaring 20s, the dirty
Right.
30s. When we look at the Great Depression that happens in 1929, the stock market crash. Everyone, if you know, when you go to high school, everyone's like, the stock market crash. It happened. The stock market crash was not the main factor of the Great Depression. That was the last final straw that broke the camel's back. There were many other factors that led to the Great Depression. Of course, one of them being the overinflation of agriculture.
Correct.
And the overproduction of agriculture. That's probably the
the
primary
Dust Bowl.
reason.
Yeah.
That's the primary reason, right? And I think we covered this in a podcast before, but I always tell my students, and just a very quick analogy, if you're a potato farmer, and these numbers I'm just throwing are crazy, but you grow 10,000 bushels of potatoes, right? And now with the Industrial Revolution, you buy a tractor and equipment, but you buy it on debt, right? You buy it on credit because credit's around for the first time. But in the 19-teens, World War I breaks out doing these big government contracts. So you go from producing 10,000 bushels of potatoes to maybe producing 25,000 bushels of potatoes. But it's no big deal because you're getting government contracts. You're making tons of money. You're paying off your tractor and your equipment. But now when the war ends, you don't have government contracts. And now you're producing 25,000 bushels instead of 10. All your neighbors are producing that.
Yeah.
Now you take it to market and the potato value is worth nothing. You're overproducing. Most people won't even
Can't
buy
pay
your
your debts.
potatoes. And now you're in debt on top of it. Now you have to pay your tractor off. So what happens? Well, you lose a farm. And now a ton of the Midwest loses their farm. And now we go from a surplus of food to actually a shortage of food, which explains the breadlines of things.
Right.
And the entire economic burst. You could have the Dust Bowl. So there's so many different elements that take place in the Great Depression. But the stock market is just a very, very small part of that.
That's a very good summary.
I think so. That's what I always do, like my survey classes. And if you look at Coolidge, one of the things he was asked for in his time period was for help and relief for the
Right,
farmers.
and he would not help the farmers.
And he wouldn't do it.
He would not help the farmers.
This ties what you're saying. I think in some ways maybe Coolidge did feel responsible for not necessarily aiding the farmer, and then the decline of the farm was the beginning and the catalyst that led to the Great Depression.
And the fact that the government involves itself never ends well either.
Look at the issue of corn in today's time, right?
Oh gosh, yes, yeah, the subsidies and the buybacks.
Yes.
But once the government gets involved, you can't get them out of it, and then they have to stay involved. And you watch all this, and that's where I think when we get to Franklin Roosevelt, we'll see where he just puts it on steroids and exponentially gets government involvement in there to stabilize an economy. But at that point, you're artificially affecting the economy, so you have to stay in it. And today, government's in everything. I mean, it's in the business of every business. And I think that's one of the things that Coolidge said, basically, the business of America is business.
Yes.
Yes. And
Yes.
government shouldn't be involved in it.
Yes, and he said, going back to his libertarian ideas, he said, and I really liked this quote. Let me find it. He made the statement. Oh, here it is. My philosophy is it's better to kill a bad law than to pass a good one.
Yep.
And I love that mentality so dang much that he said that the ideal of presidency in this time period is to peel back some of the government. I would rather reverse governmental decisions than make new ones. Like if my presidency was just simply pulling back some of the layers of government, that means more. And we need that again badly.
We're not going to find it anytime soon because we found that there ought to be a law. The one thing I understood more than anything is everybody wants a law to protect something that they have an interest over.
Yes.
And what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? Pass this law, and you can just legislate yourself into oblivion because, again, government is only there to be the referee, not to be one of the players. They can provide the guardrails, but what happens in the middle is what is required to use personal responsibility.
Our form of government only works with an educated and virtuous people.
Isn't
that what the founding fathers have said over and over again?
That intent is clear.
Yes. It was never meant to
be all to end all.
To be the nanny state.
Yes.
If we can use the term, right?
Yep.
It was never meant to live your life for you. Like I like your idea of guardrails. It's just some guardrails, right? Just live with some common sense as a virtuous individual, and then there's some guardrails of protection. But it was never to be the nanny state. And this is, again, his economic policy is one thing I think we could really talk about because for Coolidge, his big idea was to pull back taxes, to pull back government interaction. He does more again, if you look at Reagan, he does more tax slashing than almost any other president until Reagan. He wants his goal is to bring the upper bracket down to 25%, which he achieves. And it's interesting, that won't happen again until Reagan, right? This idea of rolling back that top bracket.
And we only had the income tax for what, 9-10 years? Not even that.
Yeah,
when he was president.
And when it was first passed, there was a congressman on the floor who was like, God help us if we get to 5%.
Yeah.
And within a decade, you already see this exponential growth, right? One of the things, I'm sure you probably saw this, it's been all over the media, is if you look at the current climate, there's a lot of articles that's currently being written in the political landscape of economics that both Generation X and millennials are set to inherit more wealth from their boomer parents than any other generation previously.
Yes, I've seen that, yes.
So there's a few interesting things that I've been challenging my students with this. There's a few interesting things. One, Generation X and millennials now are finding themselves on very fiscally conservative policies because now they're getting a lot of wealth and they don't want to pay taxes on that. And then two, there's a big push with the government structure to reinstate higher inheritance taxes. Isn't that interesting? Now, what I always tell my students when I always ask inheritance tax, they're like, well, if we're going to inherit, $10 million, who cares if we give 5%? Interesting thought. Here's the issue. And this is what, I'm an agricultural mindset guy because I guess coming from that family of Okeechobee. You inherit a 500-acre cattle ranch. How do you pay the taxes on that? Especially with Florida money. Well, now you have to sell off, 50 acres? Well, that might have been your designated hay field where we made you self-sufficient. You can't even run that ranch anymore. But now give it about 4 generations and your whole ranch is gone. The whole thing was sold off to the government. Therein lies the issue of inheritance. And nobody understands this. You talk to so many individuals and they'll be like, well, if you're getting $10 million, who cares? It's not the idea of liquid assets.
No, it isn't.
That's not the issue.
No.
The issue we're talking about is family dairies, family ranches, family farms.
And in order to pay the tax, you have to sell the farm.
And within a few generations,
there's nothing to pass on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is to me, this is so applicable to where we are, right? When you look at the policies of Coolidge, we just need some common sense policies again.
And I think probably Coolidge, in his retrospective thoughts about the presidency, probably felt he could have done more to warn of the dangers of taxation, government involvement.
Yes. Yes.
And he probably, regrets not being more assertive, if you will, in his policies. And maybe he regrets not running again for that second term.
Coolidge is, we talked about his silence and his withdrawn nature, but he faced a lot of tragedy in life.
Yes.
He loses his mother at the age of 12.
Yeah.
He loses his little sister as a teenager because she had appendicitis. So he's had a lot of loss and tragedy throughout his life. And then as you and I were talking about before the podcast, his son will die while he's in his first term, not the vice president term, his first elected term.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons why he won't run for a second term, which would have actually been like almost 3 terms in the White House, but one, being for
10 years.
Yes. So, and his son, I don't know if you've read this or not, but his son dies in a really strange way.
I did not know.
His son loved to play tennis. He plays tennis without wearing socks, gets a blister on his toe, it turns gangrenous, and it kills him.
Oh my, I had no idea.
It's the most bizarre death ever, right?
Wow.
So when Coolidge faces this, it's probably one of the things that leads to his refusal to run again as president. He is incredibly popular. I think it was something like 54% in the popularity vote. It's like more popular than a lot of presidents we've had in a long, long time. He's so popular at the time, they actually want to put his face on Mount Rushmore. They want him between Washington and Roosevelt. He's a very humble guy. He's like, nah, I haven't reached that status, so we're not going to do that. But he was a big fan of South Dakota, which of course is where it is. Yep. He would a lot of times go there in the summers, and he'd spend time there.
And that's where he made his announcement that he wasn't going to run again.
Exactly. And he was a fan of the Mount Rushmore project, and they wanted to put his face on. He's like, no, we're not going to do it. Very humble guy. Just he was a good man. We talk goodness and greatness.
Yeah, he was a good man.
I don't know if he was that dynamic, great Andrew Jackson type of guy.
He didn't have any wars. I mean, he wasn't
and
tested
he had no military service.
Yeah. But
I read this too. This was comical. He ran for and won more elective offices than any other president. The man had been everything, like councilman, mayor, governor, vice governor, congressman. At one point, he had an individual ask him, he's like, you're a very simple guy. Do you have any hobbies at all? And he said, certainly running for office.
Yeah.
That was his hobby.
Gosh.
But he had spent his life as a public servant.
Yeah.
And that's the way he genuinely
And I think he was deep in his faith. He was. I believe he was named after John Calvin.
Mm-hmm. Big in the Congregational Church.
Yep. In fact, attended the first Congregational Church in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I wrote a quote down of his. I loved this. I thought this was very, very powerful as he was speaking. Here's what he said. I think this is so good. Faith is the great motive power. And no man realizes his full possibilities unless he has the deep conviction, unless he has the deep conviction that life is eternally important and that work well done is part of an unending plan. I really like that.
That is good.
I really like that.
Yeah.
He saw...
Speaks of hope.
Yes, he saw life as merely the beginning of something to come.
Yeah.
And what you do here actually matters there.
Yeah.
That's a good concept. It's the way our presidency was found. I love presidential history. Obviously, is what we do here. But if you look at Washington, if you remember from the very, very first podcast, he had on his coffin engraved "Rise to Judgment."
Yes.
There was this idea of an accounting day. There was this idea of accountability of something higher. Even if you're the highest office in the land, you still have accountability. And I think if we had that in the political mindset, again, like that should be branded on the Oval Office desk and on all the chairs in Congress, rise to judgment. There is a higher accountability than you. You may get away with it, but there is a higher accountability than you. Rise to judgment.
That's very good.
We need that again.
I agree.
We need that mindset again. And for him, he understood that there was something better to come.
Yes.
Talking again about his economic policies, this is another one of my favorite quotes. He said, "I want the American people to work less for the government and more for themselves."
My, have we changed since then. 100 years later. 100 years later.
Yeah.
And look at it today.
I want the American people to work more for themselves and less for the government.
Yeah.
We need that again. This
Yes, we
idea
do.
of conservative economic policies.
Oh, they work.
They do work every time. I want to touch on one more thing. I know we're drawing this to the end. One of the, if we kind of praise him, one of the critical things I'm going to say is he passed make sure I put this correctly, the Kellogg Brand Act of 1928. The Kellogg Brand Act of 1928 was America, and I think it was 17, it started as 17 other countries, something like that. I think it ended up being like over 40 countries. And what it was is they renounced the act of war as a means to settle disputes. It was the idea of pure pacifism. And you and I have talked about this a lot. Where did that lead to? It led to appeasement.
Yeah.
And the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, you have appeasement as being the official policy. And that leads to the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and the Nazi Party and Stalinist Russia and all the issues that take place. They were issues that went unchecked.
Yep.
And I have this conversation with students all the time on both ends of the spectrum. Students that are pacifists, students that are militant, and they're always, it's neither side. It's in the middle. War is hell, as has been said.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to go to war, right? But at the same time, if we just simply lay down and say that nothing's ever worth fighting for, you're going to end up with the worst world war, and you're going to end up with Hitlers and Mussolinis and Stalins.
Yeah.
And I guess, and again, I'm not going to say anything politically, but it makes you begin to question where we are geopolitically.
True.
What is the solution? Are we too much appeasement right now, or are we too much militant right now? Like which
I think
side of the pendulum
I
are we?
think that's what we're struggling right now is whether we can decide. Because in one sense we want to appease, but we appease by ignoring, and think we can take care of ourselves. When in fact the global environment is such that we have to be involved, and appeasement is not the best policy, and militarily is not either the best policy. But diplomacy does work with economic leverage.
Yes,
and that's where we have to understand that we as Americans hold most of the power. Is economically we can effectuate change in developing nations, third world nations, and then with our allies.
Yes.
Even if it means that we have to increase energy production in order to make sure that we can compete against Russia so that they're not dominating Eastern Europe with energy.
Yes.
That's not appeasement.
No.
That's a balanced economic policy that is influencing the use of military force, or hopefully the non-use of military force.
I found a historian. I don't remember who it was. There was a historian, a biographer writing about Coolidge's economic policy, and this is going off with exactly what you're saying. And basically, their summation of Coolidge's policy was this: when life gets better, division would fade. And that's a really, really good thought, because if you think in modern-day living, when the standard of living rises, a lot of these unrest settles down.
Yes.
If you look at the unrest, it always happens when inflation is up, when the economy is down, when unemployment is up. But look at something like the 80s and 90s in America.
Yeah.
No one was rioting in the streets.
Yeah.
No one's occupying Wall Street. There's no 1%. Why?
Yeah.
Because it was a very high standard of living. Look at the 1950s, post-World War II.
Ooh.
For the most part, except for the Korean War and, of course, segregation issues, which civil rights movement was beginning to really work on those issues. Economically, it was very calm.
Yes.
So when there's a high standard of living, typically the unrest fades.
And that high standard of living can be enjoyed by other nations
Absolutely.
if we assist them, which kind of keeps them at bay from wanting to be powder kegs and create. That's what I think would Iran, if we would allow the Iranian people to see some sense of economic capitalism, some sense, you would see, I think, an internal subversion from within that would overcome or overtake the Ayatollahs there and change the whole makeup.
It's almost like if
they don't want war.
If you can have a good standard of living, why would you want to just die?
Yeah.
But if life is hopeless, then who cares? Life becomes cheap.
That's true.
And the cheaper life becomes, the easier it is for uprising and war.
True.
The higher your standard of living and the higher your quality of life, the harder it is to talk someone out of leaving that to go die.
Yes.
That's just historical truth, right?
And human nature.
That's just historical truth. And again, what you just summarized is really the layman's understanding of the wealth of nations by Adam Smith.
Yes.
Right? That's all Adam Smith is saying.
That's a very good point.
Is instead of actually going to war with people, trade with them, let's both get prosperous, and then neither one of us want to go to war because we're both making money off of each other.
Yes, we're interdependent on each other, you know?
Why has America and China not gone to war?
Oh, yeah. We're
Right?
their biggest customer.
It works. We're going back to the Scottish Enlightenment of the 1700s, the wealth of the nation, but it works. If we can raise the prosperity of nations together, and if we can raise the quality and standard of living together, we're not going to want to fight each other.
That's true.
But the cheaper life is, the easier it is to have uprisings. Yep. And this is the reason why. I feel like we circle back to the economy a lot, right? Is the economy stupid? But it really is the economy stupid.
It is.
Because not only is it the economy for winning elections, it's also, and again, this sounds way oversimplified, it's also the economy for keeping global peace.
Yes.
And that sounds super oversimplified, but there's a lot of truth in that.
Oh, there absolutely is.
And I think Coolidge understood that.
Yes.
I think Coolidge's main mentality in running for office was economics.
Yeah, look at our Mideast policy back when Mubarak was in Egypt, and you had Anwar Sadat and who did the peace accords with Malak Begin. One of the things that America did is we started investing in Egypt to keep them as from militarily getting involved with Israel.
Yes.
And then when Mubarak takes over for the next 30 years, until the Muslim Brotherhood comes along, we've got peace with Egypt. Now we still have peace with Egypt, but because we've developed economic relations. Same thing with Jordan.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think the same thing with the UAE and Israel. They all realize that economically we need each other.
Exactly.
We need customers if we're going to produce.
I had a professor one time that was he was teaching a geopolitics class, and he was talking about the radical Islamic element. And he made the statement. He said the downfall of radical Islam will not be war; it'll be economic prosperity.
Yeah.
That where they live with oil and things of that nature, the more economically prosperous they become, the more they're going to walk away from radicalism, and the more they're going to walk to a better standard of living.
Yeah, and the standard of living changes everything. The more it rises, the less intense they get. They become accustomed to wanting to have trade, to have relations, and enjoying life.
Yeah, because the better your life becomes, the less likely the communistic message resonates of what, a chicken in every pot and a radio.
Yeah.
Who cares? Who wants that, right? Because if you work hard, you're able to get a better standard of living that anyway. I don't need the government giving me a radio and a chicken in a pot.
Right.
Instead of that, I can work hard, live the American dream, and actually build something better. And that's where I think it's not that we argue our way out of these new socialist tendencies. We just show that the standard of living can be better without them.
Yeah, and that changes everything.
And this is what Coolidge was all about.
I agree.
So Coolidge for 2028.
Yeah, if we could bring him back.
All right, well, this has been Calvin Coolidge. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast.
Thank you.